make yourself comfortable and we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and can I just start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Gunai people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Sharon Fisher and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Bushfire Recovery Victoria, which is a new agency that's been established in response to the latest bushfires in East Gippsland and in the Corryong area. Really, that agency is about collaborating and coordinating on a statewide level to bring everything that we need to assist your recovery. But we're also working absolutely in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, and I know that they've been on the ground and many of you have had interactions with them and had a fantastic experience. So on behalf of DHHS and also East Gippsland Shire Council, so we've been really working in partnership with all our key stakeholders to make sure that we get information to you and we have very important discussions like this one. So welcome. I'm really pleased to welcome Rob Gordon to Mallacoota. As many of you know, Rob is a clinical psychologist and has worked on many disaster events and really has a deep, profound understanding of how to process your experience and also the keys and the triggers that you should look for, but also a lot of really practical strategies. So it'll be fantastic to hear from Rob today. And I think the flavour really today is to think about Mallacoota in the early stages of recovery. So a lot of you have been through the experience of attending to your needs and getting some very quick results around what you need to stabilise your lives. The next really big move for you is to think about how to, with your families and your friends and your community, really think about the steps for Mallacoota and the surrounding areas recovery. So without further ado, I'll throw to Rob. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody. I worked on my first bushfire in 1983, where I was part of a children's hospital team working in the Macedon area. And I visited that community for 4 years on a regular basis and had a chance to see it going through its recovery process. And halfway through that time, there was another big fire around Maryborough in central Victoria. And so I found myself going there too. So I was visiting two communities 2 years apart in their recovery, and I started to see some common themes. It's very hard when you're in the middle of something that's so new and so different to really work out what's exactly happening. Because the curious thing is that in some ways every disaster is the same, but also it's completely unique. There are things that will be absolutely the same here as occurred in Christchurch after the earthquake, or in North Queensland after the hurricane, or in various other places. So I was asked to go to Fort McMurray in Canada. When was it? The beginning of last year. This huge fire, they had to evacuate 85,000 people, and there were only two roads out. One went a few miles up the road to an airport and a mining company. The other went a very long way before you came to any civilization. Very different, but in many ways the problems are the same. The problems are, I think of three major problems that occur after disaster. The first one is trauma. Now the word trauma in Greek means wound or injury or damage. Right, so trauma medicine is the medical care of people who are run over by a bus rather than have a heart attack or diabetes or something. It's some external impact. And the psychological trauma is when an experience impacts on you with sufficient intensity as to damage or disrupt your ability to process it, come to terms with it and move on from it. So I want to talk about trauma a bit later on. The second one is loss. And of course there's all sorts of losses. There's loss of houses, loss of pets and animals, but for the people whose houses didn't go, they've lost their neighbours and their community perhaps. I remember speaking to a woman after the Canberra fires. When was that? 2003. And she said, no one wants to come and visit me because all the houses on either side have been destroyed and they feel too sad to come and see me. How do you think I feel living here every day and all my friends have gone? So her whole life has changed, hasn't it? She's lost the fabric of her life. Now she's still got a house, of course. We don't know what losses people have experienced because they're private. And I think it's very important to bear that in mind. There was a flood in a central Victorian town, and I went and did a community there meeting, and a woman who was sitting sort of halfway back in the audience had a very sad look on her face, and at one point she sort of put up her hand and said, is it right that some people would be feeling upset even if they weren't flooded? We could say didn't lose their houses. And I said yes, and I talked a bit about how complicated it all is and how personal it is. And then she said, oh, thank you very much. Actually, we were a little bit flooded. Our shed was flooded. And there was a woman sitting behind her who rolled her eyes as if to say, oh, you poor thing, your shed was flooded. I feel so, because probably she had a terrible flood. But because the woman in front of her looked so sad, I just said to her, what do you keep in your shed? She said, all the effects from my mother's estate. She died a couple of months before the flood. You see now, it's history and identity, isn't it? Of all that family history that she hasn't sort of worked out what to do with, and it's all damaged or destroyed. And theoretically, you could have someone have a nice new house full of, Harvey Norman furniture or something, and it's well insured and it gets flooded and it's all replaced, and I hardly know it's happened. Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification, isn't it? But how can you actually equate the two? You can't. And so what I've learned is we've got to be very open-minded about what the nature of the loss is and how do we actually go through it together. Because one of the things I'm going to emphasise is the best resource for recovery is each other, the community, being part of something bigger. The third impact we have is disruption. Even if you didn't lose your house, has your life been disrupted by this event? Yes, of course. How long will it remain disrupted? Are you back in routine yet? I've gone this couple of weeks. Fire's out, isn't it? Why aren't you back in your routine? Well, it's very hard to explain, except everything is different, isn't it? But here's the point I've learned. We build routines around all the important things in our life. Like talking to our wives. I have to talk to my wife nearly every day. Right? Otherwise things go wrong. So, you get into the routine of doing it. But you could easily get sidetracked where you think there's an incredible lot of things to do and you just leap out of bed and do them all and fall asleep at the end of the day and so on. And you might say good morning and good night, but you can easily drop out those things that are part of your routine, like talking to your friends or being with your family or having a bit of private time. We haven't got time for that sort of nonsense. Don't you realise we've got insurance companies to deal with? We can't sit around after dinner and just chat. That's the risk, you see. And I want to explain how from the trauma process, our brains go into a state where it's very hard to hold those structures of our lives. The structures that regularly involve us in what gives our lives meaning and value. You know, going to the bowls club and spending an afternoon with your friends. Really look forward to it, you enjoy it, you feel good afterwards, or whatever it might be, and it just goes. Now we can put those things aside for a time, but often we don't realise we've done it because we are preoccupied by why we put them aside, which is very urgent, complicated, worrying problems. And we can go down the track and come out 6 months, a year, or 2 years later, and we haven't picked those things up, and they've fallen away. And it erodes friendships. Friendships also get eroded when the disaster have different patterns of impact. How do we actually equate the experience of somebody who evacuates before the fire, or maybe even, as I've heard, went off on holidays before Christmas, and their house is burnt down, they're not even here, and they come back. It's a terrible experience. Versus somebody who stays, fights the fire at the risk of their life, thinking maybe they're going to die, and manages to survive it and keep their house intact. And I know the story of a person who did that on one of the bushfires earlier in this decade, who said that was such a terrible experience, I will never do it again. We saved our house. I would much rather lose my house than go through thinking my wife and daughters and the other parts of my house had died, because he didn't know whether they were alive or dead for some time, because they were fighting the fire. They couldn't leave their places. They had a well-rehearsed plan, it worked perfectly, but they didn't anticipate the inability to know what was happening to other people. He said that was a very traumatic experience. I would much rather lose my house. How do you actually equate that with someone who's actually lost everything they own? Well, you can't, can you? Except to say we must respect everyone's experience for what it is. So this disruption also makes it very hard for us to understand things, because we had ways of understanding our community that are based on routines and interactions and assumptions about things. So think about it this way. If I have a routine in which I, do things that I enjoy, that I spend time with my friends, I contact my family, I engage in my hobbies and so on, I have a set of routines that give me a complicated and well-balanced life. Now, if I do that in a routine way, each of those elements becomes like a structure. It becomes like a skeleton, like a framework in my life. And I don't have to think about it. I just know it's bowls on Tuesday afternoon, so off I go. And everyone knows. And that anything that is stable and gives us some kind of reward is a security factor, isn't it? It's an emotional security factor. So healthy people get stressed and upset and worried about things, maybe worried about the share price, but you're going to have bowls, and as long as you don't talk about the share price over a cup of tea, but you can just relax. And so your stress level comes up and then comes down, goes up, comes down, and so healthy people develop in their routines ways of managing things and keeping their lives in order. Now, if we push that all aside, and you're involved in in whatever way, all the consequences of a disaster, and there are multiple ways you can be involved in things that are very unusual, apart from if you lost your house. All of that goes out the window, and you don't think about it. If there were one piece of advice I would want people to carry into the recovery period, it's this. Try and think about what did you regularly do that gave your lives value and meaning. And ask yourself, am I still doing it? And if not, what's happened to it? And then make a decision to recapture it, because we can't let it go for too long. And I want to explain a little bit about what happens with this initial state that leads to this trauma state. And then I'll talk a bit about the post-traumatic reactions that we can expect to have and how we help ourselves work with those. So the disaster represents a huge life-threatening experience, but it's not just life-threatening, it's usually overwhelming to our senses, isn't it? We've never seen, heard, felt anything like this. Armageddon, must have been like hell. You know, all those sorts of metaphors are used, extreme metaphors, to try and grasp that this is completely inconsistent with our previous experience of nature and the environment of the world. It's very, very difficult to come to grips with that. And don't we want to talk about it over and over again? We have to describe it. Now, when we're confronted with something like that, our bodies and our brains have an instinctive survival mechanism that just switches on. We don't have any choice about it, that just switches on. And puts us into a state, we call it, of high arousal. Arousal just means the overall activation of body and mind and emotions to flood us with energy. The main chemical involved is adrenaline. And, you know, as I've talked to people over these 35 years or so I've been involved in this stuff, you know, I've gone away and looked at the research and then listened to people again and so on. And I've developed a way of sort of trying to give you a picture of this, because I think it's very important that everyone understand it. Just as if the sewer was running down the main street, you'd need a lot of information about bacteria and hygiene and how to sterilise things and keep your hands clean, wouldn't you? In the same way, I think we need to understand this issue of arousal. Now, arousal's got one aim, and that is survival. Of what? Survival of an immediate physical threat. So what adrenaline does, and you've all been in a state of adrenaline, is power up those functions that help us focus on, identify a physical threat there, exactly there in the world, and deal with it. And in order to do that, we would go into an incredibly narrowed focus. When psychologists do experiments on people, and they sort of put them under higher and higher stress, they notice there is a steady narrowing of their attention, so that if they've got a complex array of lights and they've got to press button A if that pattern goes off, and button B if that pattern, button C if that one goes off, and you put them under more and more pressure and time constraints, and you pushing these patterns at them faster and faster, in the end they just focus in on the bit straight in front of them. And they'll get that right, but they won't see the other things. Now, we all do that under adrenaline because it's there for the fire front, the charging bull, or whatever might happen. And that narrowing of attention makes us much more focused. It's what we need, for instance, when you have a near miss in a car. We've all had them, haven't we? Is that just my driving? and you actually zero in on the front. I can remember zooming up the inside lane of traffic late for a meeting, and all the cars were blocked at the lights. And as I came up, this bloke in one of those old light blue patrols that's got a big bull bar on the front and a sort of that slightly curved little thing. Can you see how vivid my image of the front of that? I have no idea who was driving it. I was watching it come around. I thought, oh my God, he hasn't seen me. Oh, yes, he's seen me, right? So I went into adrenaline mode. And what adrenaline will do is absolutely focus you on the relevant. It was the bull bar that was going to hit me first, so that's what I was focused on, you see? And that becomes imprinted in my mind because my mind is totally open to those details. I remember talking to a woman after Black Saturday in Bendigo, and she described how she came to her back door and she suddenly saw her back fence explode in flames. And I said, "What did you think?" that I didn't think I was just in the moment. If we're in very high adrenaline, we don't think at all. We're totally in action mode. Now, the part of our brain that involves is the right side of our brain. That's where we think in pictures. But we know too, don't we, that pictures are very closely connected with emotions. You've only got to look at a picture and you feel something. You've only got to have a feeling and you start to imagine what might be going on. And you see, so what we tend to get is a sort of looping between image and emotion. And the fact that you have these incredibly vivid experiences where very dangerous things happen sets up these sort of, we call them flashbulb memories, these memories of particular moments where you thought, oh my God, I'm going to die, or oh, this is going to happen, or that's going to happen. And then the emotions give over. And so this sets up one of the most important of the post-traumatic reactions, which is what we call intrusive recollections. They're not true memories. The memory would say, yeah, I remember back there in 2020, that was that terrible bushfire in Mallacoota. And yeah, I remember I was very upset at the time. You know, that's very calm, isn't it? I'm giving you information about feelings. That's not a traumatic reactions. Traumatic reactions is someone after Black Saturday coming around the corner in the Christmas Hills to go down to Yarra Glen to a meeting in the middle of winter, and there's a fog bank, and she jams on the brakes, pulls over to the side and goes into a panic tank and has to talk to herself, say, it can't possibly be smoke, it's been raining, it must be cloud, it's all right, like, you know, and gradually calms herself down. She's flown straight back into that arousal because the link between the image of the grey stuff reactivates the image of her experience of Black Saturday. And that's the intrusive recollection and the trigger effect we talk about, that simple experience of grey stuff. Now, what I've learned is you can't predict what your triggers are because you don't know which bits of the experience have actually left these little booby traps in your mind until next summer. I live in Yarra Glen. We were completely surrounded by fire on Black Saturday. Luckily the wind changed before it went over my place, but it was as black as night at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You probably know what that was like. You know, it's now, you know, we've had a bit of rain. When the wind blows blustery from the north, the way it did that day, I don't get quite as agitated. I do if it's hot. But even in the winter for the first few years, if the trees were rocketing around with that north wind, even though it's cold and there's a bit of mist and drizzle on it, I was feeling very uneasy. You know, my arousal was going up because of the trigger. So how do we actually deal with those? Well, we've got to use the other side of our brain. You know, we've got images. I hope we haven't got any neuropsychologists here, but I'm a neuropsychologist. But this is my simplistic idea. We want really a kind of fairy story to make sense of it, don't we? But these are the basic principles. More dominance of image and emotion and thinking in pictures and actions and what do I need to do on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, language, thinking, reason, logic, putting things in sequence, drawing conclusions, right? So what do we need to do? We need to talk about what's going on in this side, because what's going on in this side is just the dramatic moments. So what's dramatic? When I'm in danger. What's not dramatic? How I survive. Now, if you listen as you tell the stories to each other, I bet you get the story of, I'll just make something up, suddenly there was a spot fire started something just over my fence and it started burning and it started galloping towards the house and I couldn't remember where I put the hose and I started running around and doing all this and I thought, oh my God, we're not going to make it here. And then what will they say? this was the most terrible experience of my life. I'm not sure if I can stay living at Mallacoota, or why wasn't the fire brigade there? What did they think they were doing? Having coffees down in the shops instead of actually, it could be all sorts of... Because what's happened is this image has stimulated a lot of arousal, and if arousal can't go into action, it goes into emotion. And the emotion it will go into will be one of two: anxiety or anger. So people get angry. They get angry if they can't do what will reduce the threat. Right, now think about that as the threat becomes insurance claims, or the provision of services, or the clearing of trees. We really need these trees cleared, or whatever, and nobody's, all my arousal is going to convert into anger. And then I'm not likely to abuse the first person that comes to do a survey of the trees to why they didn't come 3 weeks ago. It's not helpful. So that there is something about this continuing state of arousal that creates turbulence. And then when my wife says to me, "Now calm down, you don't need to blame this bloke for the fact," and it gets clustered around everywhere. So what we need to do instead is to realise that in the story that I'm holding, there's no survival outcome, is there? The story I've told you stops at the point of greatest threat. If you listen to that, what happens when the person in their story gets to the point of greatest danger and threat to themselves? Do they continue the story on to show how they survived and got out of it? Now, I won't say they always don't, but mostly they don't. They go off into some emotional reaction, which means the little memory system in their brain that remembers the danger isn't connected with the survival memory, what they did to achieve it, that they did in fact eventually remember where the hose was and plug it in and get it going and did enough to survive that, right? Somehow they bumbled around and managed. And so people afterwards don't remember that. They remember what they thought was going to happen, what might have happened if they hadn't found the hose, and then they're no longer in reality, are they? They're in their imagination. Can you see? And imagination about danger is anxiety. And you can't solve it because it didn't happen, but it might happen. And so you get this, setting this situation up where you become more and more apprehensive that, it'll spread to other things. So one of the best things we can do in a community is to encourage, when people start talking, try and just be curious. What happened next is the only question you have to ask when they stop. When I'm training other psychologists about this, and we run role plays where somebody pretends to be somebody who's had a bad experience and somebody else is talking to them, and they give you this blast of the initial experience, and then they just stop always at the point of high arousal. They do it quite spontaneously, and I stop and say, "This is the ad break," like on TV. It always stops at the most exciting, so that you'll get an ad for something and you'll watch it if you want to know what happens. And this is the point where you're actually seeing there's a rupture in the way things are organised in your mind and your brain, so that the bad news is not connected with the good news of how you survived. And that means the bad news keeps going around in its own little loop, and the energy can't escape. But when the energy goes around and into the good news, and you actually tell the story of how you escaped, you might be very happy with it. You might have made lots of mistakes, but you can take that out as learning, can't you, for next time? And change your fire plan and buy new equipment and say, next time I'll be a lot cleverer. And now, here's the thing. In order to deal with the intense arousal of such an experience, you have to do that many times. But if every time you go around it, you don't go down that track of how you resolved it and reassure yourself that you are safe and you did survive, or other people helped you or whatever, then you're not getting anywhere, are you? Now, I reckon the way we build up post-traumatic reactions that are very hard to get rid of is that we go round and round and rehearse them in our mind in these early weeks and months. We keep them going round and round and round. A few of you, I notice, are mature like myself. Did any of you have to learn 20 lines of Shakespeare or Wordsworth every weekend for a test on Monday morning? Yeah? And probably, if I exerted enough stress on you, you'd probably remember bits of it, wouldn't you? Because it'll be in there somewhere. How did it get in there? Rehearsing it over and over again, right? Can you see that when you've got this stuff going on in your mind, in the weeks after, you're learning your lines? You're imprinting only part of the story. And what we want to do is convert that into a narrative, a history, that will allow people, by telling their story to each other and being interested to fill in the gaps. All you've got to do is be curious. Oh my God, don't get sucked in by the fact that they say, you know, I thought I was going to die. And so, oh, you poor thing, that's absolutely terrible. Isn't it wonderful you've survived? What you need to do is ask them, how come you didn't die? What did you do? Right? Mobilise. The memory will be there. It's not connected. Mobilise it and make it part of the story. And if necessary, say, so let me see if I got you right. You said this and this happened, it got to this point, and then you did this. That was brilliant. Wasn't it fantastic that you survived? It's a little bit different if things went terribly wrong. That's probably when you need to go across the road and talk to somebody with training. But I think there's an enormous amount you can do for each other just by actually creating an opportunity to tell your story to each other. And that helps us convert raw lived experience into narrative, into story, which is history. And history tells us who we are. We went through the Mallacoota fire. We're not the same. So now that would be one part of the post-traumatic reactions, the memories. And you get in that way through to the ability to say, yes, I remember the Mallacoota fires back in 2020. I was pretty scared at the time. It took me a while, but I'm over it now. And that's the work we need to do. And like I said, you will have to re-experience some of the triggers next summer and the summer after that, and the summer after that, with nothing bad happening again, to put it into perspective. And that means we've got to think about it and say, oh, that's a trigger. It's not actually dangerous now because all the trees have been burned. Someone's got a campfire in the middle of winter. So I don't need to be, bring the left hemisphere in and talk down your right hemisphere. Use language. And share the devices you learn from each other about what you do when you feel that. The second reaction is the heightened arousal keeps us on edge, keeps us G'd up. That means we can't concentrate. People who have serious post-traumatic stress, say from a criminal assault or something, sometimes can't read a book for years because they cannot concentrate. They keep reading the same paragraph. Did anyone notice that? They have trouble settling and going to sleep. They wake up often. They just feel restless. A whole range of, not to mention muscular tensions and so on that show that their bodies are hyped up. So this continuing state of arousal is a problem. Now, if you're in a constant state of arousal, you get irritable and impatient as well, don't you? And so one of the things we want to actually sort of establish is could we call it a recovery culture? A culture is a set of understandings and knowledge and beliefs and attitudes and values that support recovery. So over the next year or two, if Rob is being irritable and bad-tempered, we want to just look to each other and say, well, Rob must be in high arousal still. I wonder if he's had a trigger. Rather than say, I hate his guts, he's an ignorant swine, whatever, right? See, reacting to it. We want to take this perspective and say, we don't know what the disaster has involved because we're not going to know all the details. And so if we can have that first step of, giving people the benefit of the doubt. The third reaction is what alternates with the constant high arousal and their intrusive memories, which is numbing and detachment. We just shut it down. I'm over it, I'm just shutting it down. And then people become disengaged and detached. It sometimes looks like exhaustion. And when that happens, I think it's really important for people to, hopefully loved ones, to give each other their feedback. And friends say, look, you haven't been talking for a while. How is everything? And try and engage them if you can. Because this withdrawal, some people are more inclined to it to others. This withdrawal is a problem. It means we're not processing it. And so that's also something which leads us, with the best will in the world, to have another beer or another glass of Chardonnay or whatever after dinner, and just as part of the numbing, just smoke too much, eat too much, drink too much, and we get into this development of unhealthy lifestyle routines. People often will come out of this period of where you're feeling tired and down, and their diets change, their exercise patterns change, their use of alcohol and cigarettes and anything else is changed, and it's very hard to actually deal with it. And what I think is very protective there is to try and actually make a decision to take care of your health as a first priority. It's actually more important than getting your insurance claim through. It's more important, isn't it? Eventually your insurance claim will get settled, but if you postpone your health for 6 months, you may not get it back to quite where it was. Now, we don't diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder until 1 month after the event, because it's normal. Everybody has a bad experience, has these reactions. They show that our system is overloaded, it's not processing. And in this state, we don't make good decisions. We make these snap, judgmental interpretations about things, jump to conclusions, which are not helpful. And if we are unfortunate enough to have lost our house, then this is a really important moment, because when I talk to people years later sometimes, I look back and say that disaster of bushfire was a watershed moment. A watershed is where the water flows down that way, and at this point it starts flowing down that way, and we say a watershed in our life is where directions of things change, the values change, what I'm headed for changes. Because we've all got goals in our life, haven't we, that kind of direct us. We don't hold them in our mind all the time. Maybe it was the same trip to Bendigo where I talked about that lady. I remember I was driving off, coming around the ring road, thinking to myself, what will I talk about in Bendigo this time? And I was thinking deeply about it, and as I came up to the Tullamarine turn-off, I suddenly thought, hang on a second, where am I going? Am I going to Bendigo or going to the airport? I'm going to Bendigo. I'm on the wrong side of the airport, on the freeway, and I sort of, made a sort of obnoxious nuisance of myself, and sort of got myself to the right part of the freeway. And then I didn't have to think about where I was going, did I? For the next hour and a half until I get to Bendigo. Can you see? I didn't really need to think about it once I got onto the ring road until I got to that fork, and then I need to think about it, and then I don't need to think about it. I think our goals are like that in our lives, aren't they? You might have a goal to come and live in Mallacoota, and then you don't need to think about why you came here until your house burns down. But then you might have to think, do I still want to be here? Or, yeah, I still want to be here, so what do I need to do to rebuild? And people have often said they've actually reconstructed. They've been under the mistaken assumption that recovery is replacement. Recovery is about replacing what you've lost. But you can't really, can you? Way back in Ash Wednesday, a woman told me that they lost their house was a relatively new one. They rang up the builder and said, sort of a few days later, have you still got the plans for our house? Yes. Would you please build us another one? And it was up in no time and they were into it. And then she had this really odd experience. People would come around to visit and she'd say, oh yes, I've got one of those. It's in the cupboard here. Wrong cupboard. Oh, it's not there. It got burnt in the fire. She hadn't absorbed what had happened, and yet she had to. She was in this very odd, disjointed experience. These are things that show up further down the track. And while I think some people's lives are very clear and they know where they're going, they know what they're doing, they know exactly what they want to do straight afterwards, I think for many people this is really an important moment of change where it can give your life really important value if you take time to say, what does this mean for my life now? To think about. We had a meeting in Kinglake in about the third year in the middle of winter. And sort of towards the end of it, lots of problems were aired, and towards the end of the time, a woman said, actually my house is up and I'm really enjoying decorating. It's the first time I've ever had the chance to decorate a house from woe to go. And I'm really having a wonderful time. But the other day, I sat down with a cup of tea on Saturday morning and I thought, now, what were the goals of my life before this fire and these, she should have said, 3 years of incredible activity? But I couldn't remember, she said. Can you understand how you could be so busy for a few years that you have the feeling you've lost the connection with who you were and what you're on about? And these are the tasks of the later stages of recovery, when things have settled down, where you think about, what does this mean for my life? And I think as a community we need to do this together. It means we need to have conversations, compare notes, share experiences. This is where the artists are really valuable. Songs and stories and poems and pictures and sculpture, about what does it all mean? Because it's a huge experience, but it takes, I would say, months or years to really understand what's been touched by this, right down to our core values and our core sense of community. And so I really think, for me, there's no question that good recovery is, I won't say slow recovery, but it's paced and steady. You're about to run a marathon rather than a 200 metres hurdles. Even though the first hurdle you come up to is, registering and making applications and building permits, and if you're doing that. So even for those who just had a traumatic experience, we know that the remedy for trauma is meaning. We have to change the meaning. Is the world a dangerous and unpredictable place? No, but we have to incorporate this into a bigger picture. And I think this brings us back to community. There's an American, I'll just finish with this and see if anyone's got any questions, but there's an American professor. He's a professor of political science, and he moved into a new job in New Orleans University a couple of weeks before Hurricane Katrina, and he didn't have any experience of disasters. So when the evacuation came, he did the right thing and put the family in the car and drove over the state border and stayed with his relatives. He didn't even take his computer, he said, and everything was lost. Well, he's done some very useful research. What he's done is he's actually researched what determines the quality of recovery. He's even looked at the Japanese tsunami, and he's compared those communities. It was such a big event that he could compare the communities that put all their money and energy into building infrastructure, big concrete seawalls and so on, versus those who put their money and energy into community networking and warning systems. And he said you can directly correlate the number of deaths with how well they did that community networking. The number of deaths is not predicted by the seawalls. The seawalls were just picked up by the wave and smashed into the buildings behind it. But what was what predicted it is that people warned their neighbours because the whole system was built around relationships. And he gives this study in New Orleans between a very low income immigrant Vietnamese, from the Vietnamese War, Vietnamese immigrant community where they didn't have much money, but they had tremendous social networking, and a sort of upper middle class, wealthy, relatively wealthy suburb. He says within 2 to 3 years, I don't know if the figures are exactly right, but this is the principle, they had 80% of people returned and got their business going. In the same time, the people from the other community had about 20 to 30% return. He makes it very clear that the core of our life is our social relationships, the sense of belonging. Even if we don't have cups of tea with each other, we have a sense we belong. Now, our experience working in disaster Victoria is over years, decades, is that those people who get out and engage in community activities, meetings, barbecues, planning groups, art groups, whatever is your particular interest, do better. They do better, their recovery progresses faster, and we noticed, for instance, after Black Saturday that, now, I don't want to be sexist here, but men tend to go out and do stuff. Women talk to each other. Right? Is that all said right down here? Yeah. Now, the women are very networked, so therefore, if you look at the stats, women actually complain a lot more about emotional difficulties. They feel anxious and unhappy and depressed, and the men say, I've got to go to work. And they go out to work because they're using the right hemisphere, building fences or whatever. And the women are talking in the left hemisphere, and they're talking about all how complicated it is, and men not thinking about it. No, making it very simple. And so the women were heavy users of support services in the first couple of years, but in the third and then in the fourth year, towards the end of the year, suddenly a whole group of men come out of the woodwork and say, we thought we could do this ourselves, but I've hit the wall and I can't deal with it. I feel depressed, I feel despairing or whatever. It was this group towards the end of the third year and then another group towards the end of the fourth year. Now, I reckon they've postponed attention to their own needs. And I think it's really good to have opportunity for men to meet and talk, and men's sheds and whatever, and women to have their networks, and then we also need the whole community. So what I'd be saying is I think it's so important to try and get out there and put behind you whatever sort of frustrations you might have had with community, and we all have, people we do get on with, right? But really see that what you have in common is the community. That's your most precious value and resource. And to try to actually put aside that high arousal. What will bring down arousal? Pleasure and leisure. Chilling out, relaxing, and enjoying yourself. And to try and promote that through whatever community events you can. And then you'll talk, you'll process things, and people will feel included. And a lot of people who say for the first time in their lives after a disaster, they felt part of the community. Isn't that fantastic? And then out of this comes the opportunity to, through the structures that will develop, the policies are all there, aren't they, for developing some kind of community representational group that will put your personal views, your community views through as the government starts the replanning process. And then you have the feeling that it's my community, I've had a stake, it hasn't just been done to us. But to do that, we have to get out there and be involved. So my message really is, I think, to take time to start building those routines, hanging on to the important one in your own life, building recovery routines, opportunities to meet together. You've already got regular meetings, circulating information, becoming self-aware, helping each other through this, conversations in this sense of community. And what we know is most people recover very well. And when they look back decades later, they'll say, I learned some incredibly valuable things from that very hard experience. Yes?
I was just stretching out.
Excellent. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I've noticed that when you go downtown, you see everyone hugging each other, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yes.
You're showing love to each other.
Yes.
But when I go to bed at night, no matter how late, I have this incredible sadness come over me. I didn't lose my home,
Yeah.
but I cry, and I cry for a couple of hours. And it just seems to be a pattern that every night now I cry.
I've already heard other people say that. Do you feel you're the only person feeling it? No.
I don't cry for me.
No.
I'm crying for the people that I
For your
lost and
community.
they've lost. And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of good people up here that have
Doesn't
lost.
it expose how connected we are? Isn't it? It's very painful that that's how we discover how much we're part of each other's lives.
My son said, don't feel guilty that we didn't lose your home.
No. Survivor guilt.
Yes.
It's been documented since the 20s. Another thing that's been documented by American sociologists is relative deprivation. Relative deprivation says, I'm going to measure my amount of loss in relation to the greatest, worst loss by the most admired person in the community. And if it's less than that, I shouldn't be worrying about it. Well, that's no basis for your recovery. Your recovery is dealing with your loss. And we need a community that doesn't benchmark it. That's adrenaline thinking. Aren't you lucky you only lost one leg? Right? I've worked with people that were in shootings. And a person who had people die beside her and she wasn't touched. And she says, people say to me, aren't you lucky you weren't hurt? And she says, no, I was incredibly unlucky to be there and have the worst experience of my life. Can you see? And she doesn't want to talk to them anymore. So, it's so easy to spoil the linkages that allow people to process it. So putting aside judgment, realising. Now, isn't it interesting? You tell us this story and we can suddenly see, it's obvious. If you care about people, you're going to feel very sad. Well, that's something that deserves to be supported. Just as all the other spectrum of problems need to be respected and supported. In Jindavik, which is a little town near Mount Borbor, a woman told me, I think it was my last community meeting there in about the 4th year, she said, we've had the hug club here. It's only just starting to break down. It consisted of everybody who was here on the day. It was the same time of the year, half the population was away. Everybody was here on the day, hugged whenever they met. I said, did you know them all beforehand? She said, not really. I knew some of them by sight, but we didn't know each other that well. It's a bit of a dispersed rural community. And then she gestured to her husband, who was standing nearby having a cup of tea. She says, but I don't hug him that much. Isn't that interesting? She's hugging these people she doesn't know very well. Actually, how do the people coming back from their holidays who don't belong to the hug club feel when they get hugged, but they don't? Creates an unnecessary, problem. And what's going on that she doesn't hug? I actually invent this language. I call that homogenising relationships. You know how in milk what do? They squeeze it through little holes and they break up the big fat globules so everything's the same. Well, I think we over-emotionalise the more detached relationships. But that means we don't have the privacy or energy to emotionalise the more emotional relationships of our intimate loved ones. So the intimate loved ones become more superficial and the more superficial ones become more intimate. And it's okay in the short term, but it's not good in the long run. We want to be able to get them back like that, play bowls with this lot, be intimate with our family members. It's a problem, isn't it? I think we just need to be self-aware to work towards reconstructing the routines of our lives. Thank you for that. Anyone got any other? Yeah.
as a retired teacher in this community, I have felt very aware that there are ex-students I taught who haven't been here because they've grown up and gone away, or but have wanted to come back and now are beginning to come back. And I've said to some of them, I think it's been really hard for you because of growing up here and not being able to be here. Yeah. I just wondered if you could speak about what might be the same or different for young adults like that.
Coming back, not having experienced the fire, do you mean? Yeah.
And having such attachment because it's been there.
So we can't underestimate their grief from their childhood. Also, well, Indigenous people have a structure with that. They call it a welcome to country, don't they? So I think it would be particularly important to ensure that people who are coming back hear the story of what happened, so that when they hear it so it becomes part of their history. They hear it in relation to the landmarks and the places they know and the people they know, to give them a chance to take it on. And then I think by us including them, it's very interesting. One Black Saturday community, 10 years on, shows evidence of quite a lot of tension between a lot of people. I know this is not exactly what you're talking about. A lot of new people have come into that community, and there's a bit of a division between the old people who are very involved in the committees and the new people who haven't been welcomed and don't feel part. And another community which had this young couple come in, and they all went out of their way and invited them in, and they said, "You're our future." And they really valued them and said, "It's so important you're here, and how can we help?" And they talked about how wonderfully welcomed they felt. So I think just require a little bit of thought and awareness as to how you might welcome them. I don't know, if you have some kind of function, just say a few words about how wonderful it is, because they are the future, aren't they? Yeah. Thank you. Did you have a question?
So that's what as you were speaking, one of the things that came to me is one of your messages is don't assume.
Absolutely.
And because one of the things I'm aware of living in this little community is that many of us assume that we actually know far more about people's private circumstances than we know.
Yes. And that's to do with the nature of the routines and the assumptions, isn't it? We operate within a known world, but we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
It was the same little community where the woman lost the flooded her shed. They told me that one of the service clubs set up a weekly barbecue situation. And what a fantastic, I think that's a fantastic device for allowing people to come together. People who feel a bit sad or lonely can sort of rock up and have a sausage and talk to people. And the person who was telling me about it said the only problem was that we discovered that there were a whole lot of freeloaders coming for a free feed, so we stopped it. And I didn't say anything, but I thought, that's adrenaline thinking. What does it matter? And why are they coming? And then later on, somebody else said to me, I heard them say that, and I knew that that was being said at the time, but I always made it a point when I went to those that if I saw someone I didn't know, I took my sausage over and sat down and got talking to them, and I never found anyone who didn't live in the area. Now, it mightn't be quite like that here in Mallacoota, but you don't know who you don't know in the community, do you?
Thank you, that's exactly right.
You don't know who you don't know. So and by the way, just let's be embracing. I'll just say this one little bit, and then I'll come to you. Is that okay? look, I've been involved in disasters since 1983. In 1983, when you went to the government, I'm exaggerating a bit to make a good story, but when you went to the government to get assistance for the fact that your house burned down, you had to provide your birth certificate, your marriage certificate, the title deeds to your house, and, you know, your tax lotto. And when you said, well, they've all been burnt, they said, well, I don't know, you'll have to get copies of them from your lawyer because we can't do anything. Now, it wasn't quite like that, but there were very stringent requirements to prove that you were entitled to it. And often people, have you ever felt this? Oh, it's too hard, I don't care, I don't want your bloody money. And so they would go away. And then, you know, there was learning. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a decision to change. At about the time they brought in the whole idea of a recovery plan and realised actually recovery, in Ash Wednesday there wasn't a recovery plan. There was a welfare sub-plan of the DIS plan, and that was about provision of blankets and food and shelter. Right? There was no sense of recovery. We sort of discovered. But around the early 90s there was this decision to free up and make things readily available on the assumption that a small number of people will exploit the situation and take things they were not strictly entitled to. But that allowed all the people that were entitled to readily get what they needed. And most people, it's the other way around. They say, oh, look, I didn't lose that much. My relative deprivation says actually you need more. And what we've got to help people to understand is, if I don't take it, it doesn't mean he gets more. He gets what he's entitled to according to the requirement, the legislation. And by the way, where does this money come from? Taxes. So it's my money anyway. You know, we need to get out of our normal routine. So, yeah, what was your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, talking about preloading. Now, on the 1st of the 1st, 2020, my husband passed away on my property out of Genoa, and I was two women were evacuated to Eden, and in the meeting I got the message that night, the next night, that my husband passed away. I was rushed through to Bega Hospital because I collapsed and passed out, and meanwhile I was up there was people fighting over my will and my husband's will, which I think was pretty sick.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was all right. And then when I got out of hospital, this lady was supposed to help me with stuff. Won't mention any names. And she took advantage of me, took me over to Marimula Sand and Gravel, where I was supposed to get supplies through the Red Cross and the Salvation Army people, and just filled the boot of the car, filled the back seat, took whatever she wanted, treated me like dirt, and then I couldn't handle it, had to get away out of it, and she's got everything.
Yeah.
Preloaded.
Yeah.
And then told others to go and help themselves
Yeah.
as well, because there were stacks there. Now that's wrong.
Yep.
And that's preying on the vulnerable.
And I've heard those stories
And that's bad.
in New Zealand and Australia and other states. I've heard it in Queensland. There are a small number of people that live their lives that way. But what we've got to do is say, actually, they're not going to stop the services getting to everyone else. They probably operated that way before, and they will operate that way afterwards. So, you know, what I'd say is try and put that in the context of a person that's their lifestyle.
You're not wrong, are you?
But try to remember that most people are not like that.
No.
Even though it's very hurtful and
Because a lot of people do prey on the weak and vulnerable.
yeah, that's right.
Because
And
I just lost my husband. I think it was pretty darn right
yeah,
bad. And the way I was spoken to, I was abused
yeah,
and told that I was
Yeah.
going to grow up and
yeah.
face reality after I just lost my husband.
Well,
And I thought that was
Yeah.
pretty damn
Yeah.
wrong.
yeah. I'm sorry that's happened to you. What we've got to realise is we've got to put them in a category of a person who's got very different values. They'll be out there, and after a disaster, they'll come out of the woodwork and do their thing. But most of us try and help out as best we can. Yeah.
just getting back to your comment, you don't know what you don't know or who you don't know.
Yeah.
You also don't know what people's triggers are. For
No.
example, your suggestion of the barbecue, the smell, the smoke doesn't for me.
Yes. But what I would say is the remedy to that is to have a lot of fun at a barbecue with some very good food. You know, in due course, you will actually say, you'll be able to try to detect the difference between rump steak on a barbecue and bushfire. It'll be different. Pay attention, finer attention to the sensory impressions. But maybe you just walk past it the first time, or maybe get someone to cook what you really like.
Yeah. Cook onions. Onions always smells beautiful.
All right, there's a suggestion. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. Really appreciate you spending time in the conversation tonight, and I hope people can take away and process what Rob said and make use of it. So thank you all for attending. Really appreciate your interest and your investment in the discussion tonight. Can I just acknowledge for people who are thinking about what Rob said, and if you would like to connect with the Victorian Council of Churches or Red Cross, we have people in the rear of the building here, and that if people want to just spend time and talk this through, they're absolutely there for that. So I welcome you to make that connection.
Also, there's a couple out there if anybody would like to say anything.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks everybody, and Rob will be here 5:30 tomorrow night for another conversation should you wish to share it with anybody. So thank you for coming.
I'll try and talk about something different.
Yeah. Thank you.